get right into it. Okay, the main body of text is in Deuteronomy once again, chapter 20 this time. And I'm going to start there. And yeah, get right into it.
What was it?
Deuteronomy 20.
20.
Yeah. I don't know if you can tell, but I've been reading through Deuteronomy lately, so a lot of these. But interestingly, I find it so sometimes amazing that I can be just reading through, a particular book, and I'll feel that, I think, an idea will come into my head through the Spirit. I would say a lot of times I can tell it is, sometimes just through curiosity, or I'm like, I'm just thinking about a particular, topic or scripture. And I'll be like, okay, I think I feel like I should try to preach on this the next time I'm going to be able to preach. And then I've had this happen multiple times just in the last probably, I don't know, a couple of months, that I'll feel like that, and then I'll be like, just before bed, I'm like, okay, I'm going to read for a minute, and I'll flip it open, and the very next chapter I was getting to is on that exact topic. And I'm like, what? How is that even, how do things come out that way, orchestrated that way? It fascinates me. But anyway, Deuteronomy 20. I wanted to talk a little bit today about spiritual warfare, a particular element of it. Someone had asked me, of interest on the topic, and so I was like, well, okay, it's something I enjoy, not something I enjoy, something that's interested me, because it's a dynamic that goes on. There are people that say it doesn't, but if you've just been a Christian for very long, I think, and if you've paid attention, you'll have felt that pressure, that the enemy coming against you in various ways. And so it's something not necessarily good to be curious about, but to be informed about. Know your enemy is one of the basic principles of warfare. And starting at the very beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 20, it says, when you go out to fight your enemies, and you face horses and chariots, and an army greater than your own, do not be afraid. The Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, is with you. I am going to keep reading, probably to verse 7, I think. Maybe actually verse 8. But I want to highlight two things real quick. One, when you go out to fight, you're facing an army greater than you. Do not be afraid, because, and there is a because, it doesn't have to say because, but because the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt is with you. So the two things there, one is that there is an enemy greater than us, but the reason that we shouldn't fear is because God is with us. Amen. So I want to start with those 2 points, and I want to keep going. It says, when you prepare for battle, the priest must come forward to speak to the troops. You could probably say something about that there, but I'm not going to, so I don't get distracted. There is a dynamic to that, though. A lot of times worship goes before the host. And so there is an element there which maybe get into another time. He will say to them, listen to me, all you men of Israel. Do not be afraid as you go out to fight your enemies today. Do not lose heart or panic or tremble before them. For the Lord your God is going with you. So again, you are fighting this enemy, but the Lord is with you. He will fight for you against your enemies, and he will give you victory. And that's a key thing that pops up again and again in spiritual warfare. And something that's very important to remember is that the reason that we shouldn't fear, and the reason that we should hope for victory is not because of us and not because of our strength, but because the Lord is the one who gives the victory. Christ is the one with the authority, and he lends us that authority, but it is still his. We don't become, engines of war through our own strength at any point in time. But there's an interesting point here that I really want to point out, which I think is important and odd. Again, so often when you look into these verses deeper, it seems like there's a sort of paradox or imbalance maybe, where you have two opposing ideas that seem to fight against each other. And always when you then continue to dig deeper, you always find out, well, the Bible, the Word, from beginning to end, it is one cohesive thing, even though sometimes at face value it may seem like ideas clash. We have one of those situations here, I think, when it comes to even the entire idea of do not fear. It says, then the officers of the army must address the troops and say, has anyone here just built a new house but not yet dedicated it? If so, you may go home. You might be killed in the battle, and someone else would dedicate your house. Has anyone here just planted a vineyard but not yet eaten any of its fruit? If so, you may go home. You might die in battle, and someone else would eat the first fruit. Has anyone here just become engaged to a woman but not yet married her? Well, you may go home and get married. You might die in the battle, and someone else would marry her. And then the officers will also say, is anyone here afraid or worried? If you are, you may go home before you frighten anyone else. Another aspect of warfare is that morale is one of the most important things that sways a battle from victory or not. A lot of times in historical warfare, it was not that these two forces clashed until the last man was standing. It was almost always, in fact, one of the rules that you are supposed to do or not do is that you actually don't want to push your enemy to where they have their back to a wall, or they'll fight to the last man, and then you'll have more losses. So you kind of want to give them an avenue of escape, and morale was a big part of it. What would actually happen is when things would start to go badly, or if the morale of the troops would crack, they would turn to flee. There would be a rout. And then the winning side would just chase after them and kill them as much as they could, to try to inflict as much loss as they could as they were running away. And so usually there was a tipping point in most of those historical battles where it was the moment that morale was broken, the moment that fear really took over, that was the moment they would lose. And so this last bit saying, well, if anyone here is afraid or worried, we don't want you here because you're actually just going to poison the morale of everyone else. And when the officers have finished speaking to the troops, they will appoint the unit commanders. That was 9. That didn't have anything to do with it. I kept going. Okay, so a couple things really jump out at you because it's repeated. First it says, have no fear. The Lord your God is with you. He is the one who will give you victory. But then on the opposite side of that, it keeps saying over and over again, but you might die. And it creates this sort of conflict, I think, in our minds, where we want to have faith, or we want to believe that faith is this invincible force where as long as we believe, then nothing bad will come our way. But that really isn't what we see in Scripture. It isn't what we see, I think, in reality. I'm going to pull up a few more verses that talk about fear, that talk about faith. But for a minute there, I want to mention again this kind of, I want to say dichotomy because it's a neat word and I actually don't know if it fits here, but it keeps popping up. So I keep almost saying it and then I'm like, there's got to be a better word, so I'm going to say dichotomy because it's neat. And now that I've said it, I won't keep wanting to say it. There's this kind of opposing feeling where when we feel afraid, we worry that, oh, now that I feel fear, now it's over, right? Now I've lost. Or for instance, we feel like, that's it. We feel like faith should be a sort of denial, that as long as we have faith, nothing bad will happen to me. And if I just focus on that, I can't let that waver, because if I waver, then that goes into doubt. And if I doubt, then I'll fail. It actually creates a sort of more of a New Age idea of faith, of this idea that, see, in New Age and in certain hyper-charismatic circles where they really just went too far one way, there's no balance anymore. They love these verses on faith that talk about, well, if you have faith, you can move a mountain. Anything you believe is possible. But they really fixate on faith so much that they lose sight of who they have faith in. And they start to elevate faith itself as though faith were God, or as though faith were some magical force that you just tap into, and now you have this power. But when you really look at what faith is, you are having faith in something. You're having faith in someone, and that is God. Faith and trust so often are almost the same thing, and there's always different flavors of that. But to have faith is to trust that God. So in this case, they are having trust that God will give them victory, but it's almost soured by the fact that God will give you victory, you can trust in Him, but you may die. And that is further mirrored later on. The next verse, I'm going to go to Matthew chapter 10 next. But I want to real quick finish. So the New Age ideas are like, we have to deny that anything bad can happen. We have to refuse to even believe it. And so it's like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit sick. Well, I'm going to deny that feeling, because if I give in to that, then it means I'm not having faith. And that just isn't what faith is. Faith is trust. It is trust in God. It is trust that He will give you the victory. It isn't actually belief that you won't die or belief that you're not sick, but rather trust that God will heal you. And so that dynamic is important. So in Matthew chapter 10, which I got to turn there real quick. Should have actually put them down. It's quicker that way. I wasn't going to turn here because it's an easy one to remember or paraphrase. But 10 verse 28, Jesus is speaking. He's sending out the 12 apostles and He's giving them commands. And He tells them, but don't be afraid of those who threaten you, for the time is coming when everything that is covered will be revealed. And you go down a moment, it says, don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. It doesn't say, don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body, because I won't let them. So it's very much like in Deuteronomy. It's not saying, don't worry, nobody's going to die. It's saying, don't worry, I will give you victory. Interestingly, in a lot of those fights where they trusted in God, they didn't suffer casualties. They didn't, a lot of times. It was a total rout of the enemy. And it's interesting because there would be times where like 5 people would die in this fight of thousands or more. And they would be like, oh no, what have we done? We've sinned against God, because how could He let anyone die? It's interesting because normally in battles, there's a sort of thing called acceptable losses. They believe, they're like, well, some people are going to die when you get into a fight. And so they would be like, whoa, what's going on? Forgetting that there was that command or that word in Deuteronomy where they said, well, you may die, so get your stuff in order. You can trust and you can believe and you can go into it, even definitely hoping that you won't. And that's good. Hope is part of faith. Faith and hope are maybe not part of it, but they go together. But faith has to move beyond that fear of death. because it says, fear only God, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And then it goes on to say, how much he values us, because he values everything that he's created, even the birds of the field. And if he values them, how much more does he value us? But it's interesting that when it comes to this idea of fear, it's a difficult thing, because it's not just saying, don't fear, nothing bad will happen to you. It's saying, don't fear, almost even though bad things can happen to you, because the worst things can't happen, which is to say, hell, death, and separation from God. So no matter what, God has given us that promise, that assurance of salvation, right? That our body and our soul is in his hands, but that no one can touch our soul. But that's really hard for us, because it's hard not to fear. It's hard not to be afraid. A lot of times when people seem to be afraid of, say, death, then they're more afraid of the pain of the event, or the sorrow, or the grief, or inflicting grief on their family. And how do we go about things without fear? And it would be, I think, disingenuous for me to simply leave it right there and say, don't fear, because if you fear, you failed, and that's that. Now, it is really important. It's exceptionally important. In Revelation 21:8, it talks about how cowards and unbelievers will have their part in the lake of fire that is the second death. And it has a list of sexual immorality, of those who give in to sexual perversion or homosexuality, or, it talks about adulterers, it talks about liars, it talks about murderers, throughout those verses. And so some of those things are easy for us to get behind, because we're like, well, we're not those things. We're not murderers. So yeah, all right. But then it mentions cowards, and that's a tricky one, because it's easier to be a coward. It really is. That's the easy path. It always has been. Cowards and unbelievers. And those things, again, they go hand in hand in a big way, because what is faith again? But trust in God. And the unbeliever doesn't believe in God, or doesn't trust in God. They have unbelief. They do not put their trust in him. They do not believe that he is God, or that he can save them. And so cowardice and unbelief, they go hand in hand in that regard. But just that very thought, cowards will have their part in the lake of fire. It's kind of scary, actually, because that can come out a lot easier than other things. Jesus talking says, if you deny me before man, then I will deny you before God. And why would we deny him? Cowardice is one of the bigger ways, because we take a step back because we're in a situation where it just makes us uncomfortable, or it threatens us in some way, or it threatens our peace, and so we don't want to put ourselves out there. And so that's one of those ways that people deny God. But because I don't want to leave it at just this shallow understanding of fear, because that also, if we look at that and we take that alone and we don't take anything else into consideration, it kind of creates an unfair, maybe, I don't know if unfair or not, but it creates a wrong expectation in us that we're supposed to be just fearless in everything. And the reason I say that, now it says this, God has not given us a spirit of fear, right? But of power and of love and of a sound mind. And after I got all these verses together, and I had some notes written out, and I had been thinking about it, And I was looking into, okay, we don't need to be afraid because Jesus has given us authority. In Luke 10, it talks about that. Jesus has given us authority over them, so we don't need to fear them, the enemy. Colossians 2 talks about how the authorities, these principalities, have been disarmed by what Christ accomplished on the cross. Now, it doesn't feel like they've been disarmed. When we fight them, it's tooth and nail. I was talking to Jess about this the other day, yesterday actually, because she was, something had sparked the conversation of, do spirits, you look at haunted houses and are they haunted? Or is it that a spirit, a demon, an unclean spirit is there? As Christians, typically our interpretation, and the one that I think it is, yes, they're unclean spirits or they're demons that have, through something that happened there, they've attached themselves to that area. It says they wander in the wilderness, right? They wander about looking for a home, and more than anything, they want to make their home in people, right? For various reasons, some that we can guess, some that we don't really know. But it seems like they will also, if they can't do that, they'll put down roots like a corruption or a mildew or a mold at places or at objects. And so she was asking about, what about like, are cursed objects actually a thing? And we were talking about it and the possibilities of it. And I could talk about that more. I'm not gonna, because I don't want to get distracted right now. But it was interesting to think about that. Because when you fight them, that is the one thing that we were talking about, and I was like, the one thing we do know is that when they get their claws in something or someone or someplace, they do not want to let go. We expect that when we encounter them, we'll be able to do just a real quick cursory prayer and boom, we're done. And actually, that can be the case because the authority of Christ is so powerful that if we're trusting in Him, it can go that smoothly. But Jesus also says, when the disciples who had been given authority and they've been going out and they were marveling that at just a simple word, these demons would flee. And then all of a sudden they had the child that it wouldn't let go of them. And Christ says, this kind doesn't leave except through prayer and fasting. And there's a whole lot there to unpack, which we're not going to right now. But there is that idea, or that simple fact that they don't want to let go of what they have been given a right to be there. A lot of times they get their claws into someone or something because they've been given permission. Usually not explicitly. Usually not, sometimes, but usually not that someone has purposely opened a door and said, come on in. And it does happen a lot in witchcraft or in the New Age in various ways. But a lot of times it can be through sin. It can be through someone basically having this perpetual weakness. It can happen through, pornography addiction or drug use, substance abuse. And you think those are not explicit, someone opening a door, but they've done it through their actions. Any sin, actually, I talk about those because those are ones that you can see it when they've gotten a hold of someone. But any sin can get a hold of someone, right? In that same fashion where it enslaves them. Now, as Christians, it cannot possess us in the sense that we are possessed, rather, we are owned by Christ. So unless we give that up, they can't truly possess us. I do believe that's the case. There are people who argue that they can still maybe infest you, right? Or that they can definitely, I know they can get their claws in you, their hooks in you, they can grow little roots. They're attached to people's lives through our own actions more often than not. Right. But what I want to say is, when you have run into any of these situations, it doesn't always feel like they've been disarmed. But see, the difference before Christ on the cross and now is massive. Because before, that's why they were just amazed that He would just come in and command them to flee and they would just leave. Because that just wasn't the way it was. When they got their roots, their hold over someone then, That was basically it. I mean, to the point that some people argue that the reason that the Israelites were commanded to kill everything and everyone when they moved into the Promised Land was because those spirits had a hold of them through their actions and through the demonic worship that they had done, through child sacrifice, through all of this stuff. These demons had their roots. You know, it actually said sin corrupted the land. And so they had to go in and kill everything and everyone in a lot of those cases. And we're like, why would you even kill the children? You know, to us in our more civilized mindset now, we're like, oh, that's barbaric. And yet there is that argument that they had to, because otherwise it would have corrupted them. And it was very important that Israelite at this point in time stay separate from the nations, because if those demons got their roots into them, they weren't letting go. And so you look at the difference between that then and then after Christ, and they have been disarmed. They no longer, you know, before they basically had all rights. The spirits of the air, they just basically owned that. You know, but Christ, he broke that hold. And so that's why we can trust that victory is ours, is basically guaranteed. Because if we trust in him, and not because of anything we do, but because of who he is and what he already did. But there's still that conflict of, well, but wait a second, you might die. And that can mean a lot of different things in the context of talking about fear. But it means victory is ours, but it doesn't mean there's not going to be a fight. And that we're not going to come through it unscathed. And we can. It does happen, right? But life is just complicated. That's the thing. It's easy. It's one of the difficulties. It's kind of funny because at times I've looked to see, how do people preach? How do they prepare? What are the different ways that people do that? Because I want to try to get better at it in that sense. And sometimes I think that God has given me a talent for it, and I don't want to bury that talent. And that doesn't mean I think I'm good at it, but rather, God gives you a talent, you need to exercise it, in that sense. But then, my brain just exploded. What was I going to say there? Oh, again, right there. How do you become a good preacher? And one of the things that they expect of them, and this one's difficult for me to the point, not just difficult, like, I don't think I can do that, but more like, I don't want to do that, is this kind of, you need to get up there and speak with total conviction, because that's how you sway people. But so I'm like, if you say something, that's fact. But life is just complicated, and sometimes things aren't so cut and dry. We can know what is true through Christ, but things are just complex. This world we live in. And they can be simple at times, like the simplicity of how do we gain salvation. It's our trust in Christ. But even those simple things, when you start to really look at them, they unfold and you're like, oh, there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. And one of the things I was worried about, worried in the sense that I always want to speak what is true, speak what is beneficial. I want the Holy Spirit to speak through me. But I'm talking about this, we have to have faith. We cannot fear. Those are direct commands. God requires courage. He requires it of us. We are not to be cowards. Fear only God. Those are very simple, very bold statements. But there's a worry that if you just leave it there, then in our actual everyday, day-to-day lives, when we do experience fear, then we're like, oh, we've failed. We are a failure. And that is the concern. And I was praying, God, help me to address that, because I don't want to just leave it right there unless you want me to. And what came to me was something that I think could be explored a lot more. But God created our emotions, and He has not given us a spirit of fear, but we do have emotions of fear. Are those things evil? And actually, not always. And this is where it gets a little tricky. God did create in us this fight or flight systems. And fear is there for a purpose in that natural context, because it keeps us alive. Because if we just are like, as little kids, we're like, I'm going to go run through the woods. And this is, before humanity spread and they killed off almost all the big predators, to the point that now they're reintroducing them because we're just a better predator. Well, they're going to die. So they need to have some fear of the woods, of the wild, of the dark. But the issue there is that we kind of need to separate then the concept of fear and the emotion of fear. Because it actually is natural and it's okay for us to have some degree of natural fear. And what I mean there is you get afraid at night, someone jumps out and scares you. Oh, is that a failure as a Christian because you're not like a statue and you're not allowed to ever experience fear? Or a tragedy happens, or the threat of a tragedy, and you suddenly experience, this fear of what could happen. And that is okay. The issue and the thing to be aware of is that the enemy likes fear, and it likes to manipulate it. Right. So just like desire in us was created by God, and that's also one of the prime things that the enemy manipulates into lust and into, the enemy always twists what God has created to their purposes. And so it takes natural desire that God created and makes it unnatural. The same thing happens with fear. So it's important to make the distinction that there is a little separation between the emotion of fear and the concept of fear. And one of the ways those play out is in action. So basically, they see this army ahead of them. And God says, do not fear. Does that mean now that host of 5,000 people, the army that's amassed, that none of them can have nervousness or a feeling of fear in their heart that they have to overcome? I don't think so. I don't, because that actually is unnatural. If you see this great host of 100,000 people ahead of you and you're outnumbered 10-1, to feel like, whoa, to feel a little bit of that, oh dear, I may die. Even the priests, they said, yeah, you may die. So there's a little bit there where that's okay. But where was that not allowed? In action. In their words, if people were going around saying, we're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die. That's what happened when they originally should have went into the promised land, and the 12 scouts go out, and 10 of them said, we're all going to die. And that caused a huge problem with 40 years of wandering, and they all did die because God said, okay, you don't trust me, you are going to die. Granted, they all died, except for the children that came up afterwards, and except for Caleb and the other scout, those two scouts, Joshua, and they went into the promised land. So where fear becomes action is where it is not allowed. And that's a light way to say that. So it's okay to, when confronted with a difficult situation, feel that emotion of fear. But when we allow that to rule us and make us turn and run from the situation, we have given in to fear. That is what we cannot do. God says, don't fear those who can kill your body, but fear me, who can kill your body and throw your soul into hell. Because they were faced with believe and die, or forsake your faith and live. They were with a very real choice. And God was saying, you do have a choice there, but is it really much of one? It's kind of the same thing when it comes to those situations that we face. When we give in to fear and we turn tail and run, that is what the enemy wants. One more thing that is important enough that I'm going to go just a minute longer here. Not a literal minute. It's going to take me a couple of minutes. The enemy loves to use fear because of the way that it cuts faith away from us. Because if we are fearing the enemy, then we're not fearing God. And this is interesting. The Bible says love God quite a few times. But it says fear God way, 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 way more times. I didn't look that up for this. There's, the actual number, it's like 10 times almost more. And so it's like, nowadays we love to focus on the love of God because it's such a wonderful thing. But the fear of God is something we kind of like to shove off to the side because that feels archaic and scary. But if we don't fear God and we fear the enemy, this is interesting because what does the enemy, the adversary, wanted to be like God, right? And so often you see that. That's why there was this big problem with idolatry. The demons wanted people to worship them. They wanted to be God, and it was never going to happen. They weren't God. They weren't ever going to be God. But and a lot of the ways that they were worshipped, that people would worship idols, that still do today, it was a matter of fear. Because they were like, I'm afraid of disease and nature and death. So we're going to try to we're going to try to appease them by worshiping them so that they don't kill us, so that they don't send their disease and death. And so the enemy ruled by fear. It still does rule by fear. And it's kind of like a way for them to get worship almost, in a way. Because if they can get us to fear them instead of God, they've taken something that was rightfully meant for God and stolen it away for themselves. And they love to do that in so many different ways. They feed on it to the point, you ever think of this? Why is it that our demons are always depicted as twisted, malformed, impish monsters, right? And the only time in the Bible that it actually depicts Satan, in this case, is as a creation of God, of a thing with great beauty. And so what about all the other angels? Now there is something to be said for perhaps they fell and the corruption of sin did corrupt them into twisted, ugly things. Totally possible. But what we do know is that so often when they choose to show themselves to people, they do it in a way that is meant to maximize fear. Movies are made about it. The whole, what was it? It was a big thing. Never actually saw it, but it was a big thing, like, I don't know, 90s or 80s or something. The Exorcist. And that whole movie was based on at least a true account or an eyewitness account from a priest that had seen these things. And so they made a movie on it, and it's filled with, people were like, it's the scariest movie ever at the time. Probably now they are always trying to up that. Again, the enemy loves fear, and so the horror movie industry is something that feeds that. And it gets darker and more twisted all the time because they want to create fear. So when they choose to show themselves, more often than not, they choose to try to scare people because they want that fear. And because fear, in causing you to flee from them, it tends to create this situation where you also end up running from God. Sometimes it backfires for them. And, people that were in the New Age, and they were like, these spirit guides I have, they love me. And all of a sudden they do something that goes a step too far. Technically the beginning was a step too far, and then all of a sudden these spirits start to torment them. They get a hold of them, and now they're like, now we get to feed off your fear, if that's a thing they do. And then they start to terrify him. And sometimes those people, because they had at least a loose understanding of who Christ was, or they just simply knew his name, they flee to him. Sometimes it backfires. But more often than not, fear, they use it because it's effective. And it distracts us, and it causes us to run for the hills. And we are commanded to not do that. Yeah. There's a lot. This is one of those things that, oh man, there's so much that goes into this. And that's, that's why I'm trying, when I do this, I want to talk about one element of it so I don't get distracted. But to just sum it up, God requires of us courage. He needs us. Well, he doesn't need us. Well, yeah. He needs us to trust him. That need is for us. We need to trust him. And if we allow fear to guide us, that is when we show our back to the enemy. And that is one of those elements that they choose to use often, time and time again. And so we have both that command, do not fear them, fear God. That trust that he will give us victory, and that hope that it's all going to be okay, but that doesn't mean it's not going to stink, or be difficult along the way. So, I wrap up there. My brain fried a couple times this time, which is still a couple times less than many times. So, wrap it up. No church tonight, but we're going to stay afterwards. Okay? So, should I pray to go ahead and dismiss, though? Okay. Thank you, Father.